afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm finally moderating a panel after 3 days. My name is Maria Titizian. I'm the editor of EVN Report. And I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this panel, which is something that we think is a very important conversation to have, especially as a media organization. So before I jump in, I want to introduce our panelists. To my right is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan. He is a professor of political science at UNLV in Nevada. He is the author of EVN Report's monthly security briefings, which we have compiled into a book, and you could find near registration if you'd like to take a copy. Next to him is Rafi Kasarjian. He is the CEO of Sensean, an advisory firm. And then it's Naira Sultanian. She is the director of the Democracy Development Foundation. And finally, Artur Babian. He is the president of the Yerevan Press Club. I'm not going to delve into the conceptual framework or definition of what resilience is. I will leave that to the experts. But the notion of resilience is about whole of government, whole of society. And we have brought together whole of society here today, not whole of government. The government can take care of its own problems, I'm assuming, hopefully. And when a small, fledgling, democratic state is faced with predatory neighbors, it has to have resilient structures, from institutions to infrastructure, in order to be able to absorb the shocks that it can face. And those shocks can be conflict, it can be war, but it can also be natural disasters. It could be COVID, any number of major problems that might arise for a country. And we all know the situation that Armenia finds itself in an extremely vulnerable position since the 2020 Artsakh war, and then the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh, of Artsakh, the influx of, refugees, our compatriots who are now in Armenia, and the ongoing threats with our neighbors. So that's why we asked experts, people from business, tech community, from civil society, from the media to come together and have this discussion, because public discourse is so crucial and something that we don't engage in, unfortunately. We engage in inflammatory rhetoric and a lot of emotional, irrational sometimes conversations, and that has led us to where we are today as a country, as a nation, as a state. So hopefully this can be the beginning of a healthy public discourse. So that's all I have to say. Okay. Nerses, you first introduced this concept. I mean, you didn't come up with the concept, obviously, but the notion of resilience for Armenia in February of 2023. In September, if you recall, of 2022, Azerbaijan launched an incursion into Armenia proper. We understood acutely our vulnerabilities. So, for our audience here, please explain resilience.
Thank you, Maria. So generally speaking, in Armenia, we've never had any broader conceptual understanding of resilience, and we've always assumed that in cases of crises, it is fundamentally the government's responsibility to deal with these issues. And that may be the case, but small democracies do not simply survive by virtue of complete reliance on government. And so through time, concepts of addressing these sorts of external shocks, crisis management, fuse the notion of whole of government with a whole of society approach, as you mentioned. And the fusion of these concepts brought about the whole model of resiliency. And as you sort of touched up on the definition, we understand resiliency to basically pertain to a state's ability to resist, absorb, and mitigate shocks during times of crises. and more importantly, to enhance the systemic response to these problems. The biggest issue we've seen in Armenia with respect to crisis management has been the lack of a systemic approach. And so there's been a lot of ad hoc attempts at solving problems. It's a fusion of citizens solving problems until the government steps in. The institutions of the government are not prepared. Citizens don't understand their responsibilities during times of crises. All of these is a byproduct of having an underdeveloped structure when addressing and dealing with problems. That means that you're less resilient to crises if you have these limitations. And so developing a comprehensive resiliency model for a society entails developing the systemic abilities to be able to absorb and mitigate these shocks, or we also call sort of these hazardous and interconnected developments that affect all of society. And in Armenia, we always equate crises with war and security, and that's a big part of it. But as we saw with the recent floods that took place in northern Armenia, those can be just as damaging and harmful, if not more, to infrastructure, to way of life, to sort of the overall functionality of society. And so being prepared and being resilient is not a unidimensional phenomenon, but it includes a multitude of factors. And to sort of quickly touch up on the broader literature and scholarship on resilience, we speak of three super factors that explain how a state could become resilient. And for Armenia, resilience is very important because when we study resilience, we also study fragile states. And Armenia's fragility is a cause of very, very important concern. So, in order for Armenia to become strong, both as a democracy and as a as an state that has independent security, it must become resilient. So, all of these are interconnected. That's why we use the term systemic. And the three factors that explain a state's ability to be systemic revolve around few things. One, the literature says you must have control of corruption. Societies that have high corruption or systemic corruption have underdeveloped institutions. Therefore, they cannot address crises or mitigate problems because corruption obviously makes things dysfunctional. So, to an extent, Armenia has alleviated the problem of systemic corruption. So, important inroads have been made. The second is societal trust. And this is a problem in all post-Soviet societies because citizens do not have the political culture where they trust the institutions of the state. This trust is an intrinsic problem in a lot of these societies. So working to develop institutional trust is crucial because if something happens and the government comes and attempts to address that problem and the citizen doesn't trust the government or the given institution to address the problem, it creates more complications and thus disrupts resiliency. And then the third one, this is a little controversial conceptually, but in the scholarship they speak of high quality political leadership. Sadly, in the post-Soviet space, we don't even know what that means. You know, we have a lot of political leadership, but quality is a complex phenomenon. But in more specific terms, right, we're talking about a political leadership, and this is specific to political elites. That happen to be inclusive and functional. So. The concern about that is during times of crisis, when you have fracturing at the elite level, when you have a politicization of the crises, that makes resiliency much more difficult. So during times of war, for example, if you have fracturing at the elite level or times of, a pandemic or whatever, this harms the whole of society approach. So Armenia's ability to basically address these three super factors are going to be important in not simply having a resiliency model, so say they have a resiliency model, but it makes Armenia a lot less fragile. And that we're talking about this leading to the strengthening of a very healthy and potentially a very powerful society.
You say resilience becomes more than a policy or a doctrine, it has to become a way of life where all institutions are coming together. I'm going to ask you one more question before I move on, just again so that we put everything into its proper context. Are there examples that you could provide where small states have successfully navigated crises through, comprehensive societal resilience? And what lessons can Armenia draw? You've often talked about the Baltic states, how they even despite their small size, have been able to build resilient institutions. How can we learn from those, or is it even comparable to our region?
It's not a question of comparability. What you do is you engage in best practices, right? You model and borrow from successful case studies, and then you apply that, you tailor that to your specific needs. And in general, we always use the example of the Nordic and Baltic states, not simply because they're success stories, it's because size-wise and structurally and their success rates make them the ideal case studies where which you could borrow best practices from. But generally speaking, all societies have natural disasters. All societies have health crises. Everybody went through COVID. But if you look at sort of the empirical research, the findings on how these societies were able to deal with them, they were able to mitigate these problems in a much more efficient and less fractured way than those societies that have less resilience. More so, democracies tend to develop their resiliency modeling very differently, whereas authoritarian regimes utilize draconian laws and oppressive mechanisms to address problems, and then that they present that as efficiency. Democracies don't do that. And so the reason why we model off the Nordics and the Baltics is because they're examples of not only successful democracies, but also strong small states. And this is where the modeling comes from. And as examples, right, in cases of crises, not only do these states have the systemic modeling to address their problems, but they also have healthy relations with their neighbors or with the multilateral international institutions that they're part of, where the approach is synchronized, and therefore the problem-solving mechanisms tend to be a lot more robust. So overarchingly, their modeling, as a general structure, works. How you address the nuances of that has to be specific to the needs of your society.
Okay, so let's take the recent flooding in Lori and Davos regions. If we had resilient structures, institutions, infrastructure, how would we have alleviated not the damage, but the what's the word I'm looking for? The consequences, thank you, of that. What has to come into play for that kind of disaster to be alleviated in an efficient and effective manner so that there is less pressure and less devastation for the populations that are impacted?
So there's obviously, you cannot avoid disasters. But it's a question of how you deal with it. A very simple example: Armenia has the Ministry of Emergency Situations. We don't even know what this ministry does, why it exists. It was basically modeled upon the Russian system, prior to the Velvet, right? No, we had it, and then it was right, and it was absorbed to the Interior Ministry. So I'm tracing its development, right? So you had an entire state structure that was designed to address these problems. And the example that I was gonna give is when we had the wildfires in the Holsworth Reserve, right? Armenia was not able to address the wildfires that it had. So it had to contact Russia. Russia had to bring in airplanes, right, to basically address this problem. How can we speak of resiliency when a state becomes so fragile it could not address its own problems, right? So you've had underdeveloped institutions that were not able to address its disasters. By virtue of that underdevelopment at the institutional level, right, you attempt to do some kind of structural reform. So you absorb that ministry into the Interior Ministry. But then you have the crisis that we did with the floods. The institutions are not prepared to address these problems because the way they function, the way they work, isn't commensurate with the problems at hand. So if you have, for example, underdeveloped roads that at the most simplest flooding are going to be destroyed, if you have bridges, infrastructure that's collapsing, right? If you don't have rapid rescue systems where they're able to basically go to the given location and rescue the population there, all of these are contributing factors to crises. A simple example, right? Sweden has spent so much time and resources in training Armenia's firefighter services, right? Because they realized that if you had wildfires, you have the trucks, you have the name, you have the institution, but the execution is going to be problematic. So these are sort of simple examples that you mitigate all those crises by having a developed institutional structure that knows how to systemically address hazardous situations.
Sure, Raf, I can see you want to say something.
On this last point, is it working? Yeah. I was just speaking to someone who has a tourist-oriented business in the north, in an area that was very heavily damaged by the recent floods. And his initial reaction was, and they're dependent both on destination tourists to there and being on the Yerevan Tbilisi main artery. They also depend on that flow of traffic. And his initial reaction was, I don't know when this road's going to be repaired. It's so extensive, my season is gone. And I was speaking to him today. He said, I said, how's it going? He said, I'm expecting to have the road fixed very quickly. And that would not have been possible under the old administration where things were corrupt, where they didn't have an ability to mobilize resources to be able to fix something very quickly. So I'm just kind of reiterating the point that NERSIS made around having sort of institutions, less corruptions and institutions that can react quickly. We're not there yet, by any means, but here's one example of something going a little bit better than in the past.
Okay, thanks, Rafi. Since you jumped in, my next question is for you. How can the private sector contribute to national resilience in the face of, let's say, economic or security threats? And what role do you see businesses playing in supporting the state and society during crises?
Thank you. So, first when we think about private sector, we think mostly about economic resilience. And economic resilience, actually, if you think about it, is more of a long-term phenomenon. Like when we had the 44-day war, if the economy didn't function at full blast for 44 days, it wasn't going to kill us, right? But it has an incredible sort of symbolic and figurative impact if people can't go along, can't go back, can't go to work, can't get things done. So in the short term, it has less of an actual material impact, but it has more of a, I would say, kind of a psychological impact. In the long term, as we've seen now, in particular in Russia and Ukraine, when we talk about the, Russia turning into a war economy, it has significant sort of impact. Now, when we talk about the private sector, if you think about it, at least in terms of the adult working population, the private sector as a whole actually touches more individuals' lives than any other institution in the country, more than the government, more than the public. But these are sort of units. They could be a 5-person company or a 10-person restaurant or a 5,000-person, large corporation. Now, in the past, under Soviet times, when these were all state-owned enterprises, there was this sort of vertical kind of hierarchy that could mobilize resources to whatever extent to get things done. Now, these are all independent economic units. And what businesses look for are preparation, planning, and coordination, right? If you know what's going to happen or what you need to do and how what you do fits into the overall sort of reaction to different types of crises, it allows you to mobilize your resources more effectively and not worry about what's happening around you. And I would say, whereas economic resilience might not be as important to the business sector, one thing that is absolutely critical is the concept of business continuity, right? The ability, because you might, while in the short term, a 2-week crisis or a month-long crisis is not going to impact the economy as a whole. You as an individual business, if you have a very strategic project that you're trying to deliver for a client and half of your staff is mobilized and you can't get it done, or there's some infrastructure or cyber attack that prevents you from doing that, that has a material negative impact on your business, which can actually sort of grow over time. And so this concept of being having proper plans in place. And let's take mobilization for an example. So during the 44-day war, it was actually the first day of the war was my first day on the job as the head of the business union that represents all the tech companies in Armenia. And literally on that Sunday, we were called in because the government did something very smart. They said, we need to go across all of our critical sectors and identify those employees within each organization that cannot be mobilized because we want those organizations to be able to continue. Now, in an old sort of centrally planned world, they could just say you, but they actually had a process developed where CEOs were brought in and would sort of give lists of people, and then there would be a committee that would go through and sort of validate that no one was trying to sort of unreasonably protect people that weren't really important. Now, the concept was great. It was a mess to implement. I mean, we spent 14 days, the first 14 days of the war, in these like packed rooms in the middle of a COVID surge. We're going through literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names. And because the process took so long, the old sort of Soviet approach to mobilization was already picking people from companies because we weren't able to get through that and get the lists validated by the government and then distributed to all of the mobilization centers around those. So it was a complete mess. And so after the war was over, and we're doing a kind of a debrief and a retrospective, we, from a tech sector perspective, asked the government to let's fix this problem because it's obviously not working. And I remember very clearly sitting right across the table from these two colonels that were all, late 50s, early 60s. So clearly the bulk of their, or the sort of the foundation of their military service had been during Soviet times. And they said, yes, we now need more reserves, and we're going to revive the notion of being able to take people for up to 3 months of retraining. I mean, 3 months for an IT engineer that's in a critical role is completely insane. And we said, look, we can't do this. And they said, well, we've been doing this since the 80s. I said, exactly, that's the problem. You've been doing this since the 80s, right? And they said, listen, if somebody is so critical to your continuity, just put them on a list and we won't take them away for 3 months. And we said, that's not the issue. The issue is not protecting people from having to go to sort of reserve training. The issue is doing proper planning. So let's make it shorter. And then as a company, as a CEO, I can decide with my HR and my sort of department heads, just like you do, distribute vacation over months. Just have kind of a thing where you have a schedule of who's going to go when. It's predictable to the company, it's predictable to the employee, it's predictable to the state, right? So these are all examples of, creating resilience by being properly prepared. I want to give one other sort of quick example. When I was just watching a documentary on 9/11, and I remember, so the morning of 9/11, I was the executive responsible for my company with our relationship with FDR, which is the largest processor of credit card transactions in the US. I mean, so they're kind of like ARCA, but on a huge, huge scale. And when we went in for meetings, saw what was going on, and within half an hour, my colleague and I were politely escorted out of the building because they went into their sort of lockdown mode, where because it's completely private institution, there's no government participation in this in FDR, but they said, listen, no, sort of unauthorized people can be in the building. We don't know what's going to happen next when you go into lockdown. They had a plan. They had a plan that they were able to execute within 1 hour of this major terrorist attack on America, right? So these are just examples of what the business sector looks for, right? Planning, coordination, and preparation. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive, and I'll come back to both you and Nerses. And I was going to go to Artur, but I changed my mind. I'm going to go to Naira. Naira, you have decades of experience, not to, age you, but okay, I just did. In peace, security, democracy, human rights, you've been very, very active in Armenia civil society. And just before the panel, you were saying, well, I'm going to say that civil society is resilient, and I said, I'm going to call you out on it. Because civil society organizations and the overall vibrancy of civil society and its activities can really contribute exponentially to a state's resilience. Certainly Armenia has a vibrant civil society, although I don't know in recent years what's happened, but what initiatives can civil society undertake to strengthen community resilience against external threats, even natural disasters, economic downturns, and can you share any successful examples from your experience?
Thanks. And yes, I did come here today to tell you several success stories of the civil society. But the media is in and out of the civil society when I say civil society.
We're going to pick on Artur later.
Yeah, you'll attack him on media separately, please. But let's do a brief analysis of the aftermath of the 44-day war. I'm sorry, but I think all our examples now come from that period. And just ask ourselves the question whether the civil society in Armenia was resilient. And I don't have to remind you about the scope and magnitude of internal and external challenges at that time. And I will highlight only 4 and invite you to give me even more. So first is the humanitarian situation in which the Armenian civil society got very quickly organized, and we saw how much time and effort they spent to deliver the aid, to provide the aid, to find the aid, to their specific beneficiaries. But what they also did, I think they, on the spot, very naturally became the psychosocial support mechanism for these people. They were talking to them, taking care of their children. So this was really impressive, and something that not even us, but the United Nations and many other international organizations noted, and they were quite impressed. The other is, the second was international advocacy. Again, you should have seen how many letters we were writing, statements that would go to the international platforms, United Nations, OSCE, but also working a lot with the local diplomatic missions, trying to explain to them the scope, again, of the horror that happened to us. So then I'll mention the third one is legal protection. Again, the whole civil society, legal community got united and started providing legal support to these people. And even beyond that, we had a great case of fact-finding, conducting a fact-finding mission and producing a very useful, valuable report documenting the atrocities of Azerbaijan and the gross human rights violations. And my last point is about how significantly the civil society contributed to the internal stability and preserving democracy in the time of crisis. And I say this because I remember very well the environment, this very heavy silence that was hanging in the air in this country. And you had the ruling party that was hesitant to conduct snap elections. You had government totally paralyzed. You had media which was heavily politicized and polarized. You had opposition who was focusing more on temporary government, PM's resignation. You had church, which unfortunately had very limited influence on people. And you also had traumatized people who didn't want to do anything, let's say. And in this circumstance, in this situation, the February statement of a group of civil society, the most prominent ones, if I may say so, came up with this statement saying, we do want snap elections, and we want these elections to be free and fair. And moreover, they committed that they will play their own part in oversighting these elections so that they are free and fair. So these are my 4 highlights, showing and trying to prove to you that the civil society was resilient and did perform its resilience role. Although I bet none of them had any contingency plan in place. I can assure you that. I'll stop here.
Yeah, I take it back. You were resilient, but it's about long-term planning and having those contingency plans. Yes,
Sure.
we were very quick to mobilize. I mean, and the entire city, the entire country
Yes.
snapped into action. But how impactful was it? How efficient was it? How effective was it? These are questions I think that,
Yeah.
we don't, 2 years later, we don't go back and say, okay, let's look at lessons learned. Let's see how we can improve on that. And I think this is part of the conversation that we should be having as well.
I agree.
Artur Can, I really don't know. There's so many components to media, and of course this is a media festival, and I'm a media person, so this is why we're gonna have fun. There were so many issues with the media, and just from a societal perspective as well. We didn't know how to use social media platforms because every Armenian on the planet during the war was desperate to get the story out to whoever would listen. So we misused and abused Twitter and Instagram and all these platforms. We didn't know how to use these platforms properly, and we created more of a mess. So that's just sort of a citizen journalist kind of a perspective. The media itself, in retrospect, I think we have to be very truthful and honest. Leading up to the war, none of us wanted to talk about the shortcomings of the military because it was deemed as being unpatriotic, as being, you were working against statehood. In reality, our role as media should have been to call out the shortcomings, not only in the military, in all structures, government institutions and structures, and we were always involved or down the rabbit hole of self-censorship in order not to be called out. So that was one thing. And then the level of misinformation that continues today, and Naida alluded to the politicization and polarization of the media. In your opinion, how do we strengthen the media landscape in Armenia to become resilient and again, we don't work for the government. What we do should not be for the government. It should be for the public and for society. How do we increase the resiliency? Is it only through increasing the quality, or I want to hear your thoughts on that.
So, when it comes to media, everybody's so quick to blame. I mean, and you know who loves to blame the media very much? Like, it's the government, it's the police, the opposition, and just look back at the last month. Journalists have been beaten up. Journalists have been hindered from doing their jobs. Business are sitting there and watching the developments. Civil society, yes, they did make a couple of statements, but really, who is on the damn front lines? Look at the flooding in Alaverdi. Yes, the Ministry of Interior are there, some volunteers are there, and media are there on the ground. Like, they're literally struggling and bringing those stories to you. Wartime, journalists were shot at. Journalists were, like, bombs were directly targeted at Armenian journalists, and they were covering and they were bringing the stories. Journalists are doing an incredible job in Armenia given all the circumstances, because you have to step back a little, and globally the media are under attack. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all the other platforms have taken away all the revenue streams. We're also seeing that they're facing huge competition from propaganda outlets. And honestly, like, blaming journalists now is so unfair, because the media are really struggling. The economic underpinnings are changing. We don't know where it's heading yet. I mean, this AI is coming, and probably even the little Google Ads revenue that was going to the media is going to dry down soon. We say it's the fourth estate, but the three other estates are getting all the, tax revenues. Like, who's going to fund the fourth estate? It is not just for nothing that you call it there. Media are supposed to perform a very important role. And in order to do that, they need funding and they need support. And you call media politicized, but the only, the few streams of revenue that come through to media come from political sources. And thank God, media can be politicized and speak their free minds in a politically biased way, maybe. But, the Constitution says you're entitled to that. There are, thankfully, some media who, some of them, on donor funding, are preparing high-quality content. So we know that the Armenian media, given all the circumstances, are able to actually perform and do stellar job. Like, I'm just looking at EVN Report for such an example. I love your coverage. I love the stuff I see there. And it's donor funded. Like, try to survive on advertising alone. Then I would look at what's happening. Don't try. That's not gonna work. So, in my honest opinion, given all the bad stuff Armenian media are through, they're doing a pretty decent job. In COVID times, like since March 26, 2020 till, I don't know, September 9th or something, the country was under various stages of situation of emergency, and the media were trying to comply, and not just to comply to the letter of the law, but also ethically trying to do as much good as they could. I mean, if the prime minister comes there and says COVID is nothing more complicated than flu, then maybe, which we know is not right, and which, by the way, the US President Donald Trump wasn't doing a much better job of handling either. And the Armenian media in this situation, yes, they did some maybe ethically imbalanced things, but overall they were good. Wartime comes, new restrictions, new complications. The Armenian media were trying to give the government the benefit of doubt and reporting and complying, and you saw what happened. So now if the Armenian media are more and more critical of the government, I mean, can you really blame them? The stuff you mentioned about media literacy and Facebook, etc. You know what? That's not the problem of media to address. That's a problem for the state, for the Ministry of Education, for all other institutions to address as much as media. Yes, media are, it's in our values. Like, we are the most interested in making sure that the people are media literate and that they can value true quality media. Yes, that's what we should work on. But like, media really has to survive also somehow. So, and we see that there are certain stories which are getting better coverage than others, and there's the whole platforms that are forcing you into it. So Facebook will literally promote the posts which are more scandalous, and diminish the ones which are presenting more balanced views. So can you really blame the media in Armenia when the same is happening worldwide? So to sum up, look, media are patriots of this country as much as everybody else. Media are struggling for this country, and maybe even more than anybody else. Looking at how my colleagues are going to the front lines without even having as much as a Hamlet or some protective gear. Media have been trying to mobilize and address issues, and we see, despite polarization, how opposition and pro-government and balanced media outlets are working on the street together and trying to bring the story. So I would say that if there is at least any institution which is more or less resilient and which is able to perform even despite all the odds, media are there, and all we do need is to think not what media can do for this society, but rather what this society has to do for the media, because media is performing a function which is essential for this country and for these people. And if we don't care about this, and if we don't contribute to this somehow, we're going to perish as a whole. Like, it's an essential function for the country.
Okay, I'm going to call you out on one thing. I would argue that after the 2016 four-day war, we did not learn any lessons. I'm not going to talk about political, military, strategic. I'm talking straight out media. That when the 2020 Artsakh war started, yes, we did not have helmets. Yes, we went to hunting stores to find vests because we had to send our crew out to Artsakh. We couldn't find helmets and we didn't have the vests. My question is, when are we going to learn from our lessons to be resilient? And I'm not knocking down the media. Kavletsi, huh? I am the media as well. I'm saying that we are not learning lessons. We are not building our resiliency. We are dependent on Google, from Google ads to donors, because we have not been able to find a model to help us survive. And that's why many of the media is politicized, because that's where the revenue is coming from. So these are the questions that we need to address. This is maybe not the platform to do that, but to raise these issues so that we in the community start having these conversations.
I mean, you are right 100%, but I have to add to that. How many businesses have gone to court and taken the government to court for corrupt trade agreements? How many cases have you seen successfully when one of the best providers of, say, military equipment or good quality food to the army went to the court and got a resolution because, like, there was some corrupt happening in the background? I mean, media are a reflection of the society. If you did have a high-profile case about corruption in the media, if a soldier who was abused went out and talked about that, okay, not 100% of the media, but there would certainly be a dozen of them who would cover the story and bring it to the top agenda. But nobody's talking about corruption. Nobody wants to speak it. There are no whistleblowers. Nobody wants to take their case and defend it in a court of law, protest, and then you blame the media for not talking. Like, I've been a working active journalist 100 times. People would call to the newsroom and say, I have this corruption thing and I want to report it. And when you go are you able to give me some facts? Are you able to testify? Are you able to speak to a microphone? we're ready to, blur your face, even though that's like pretty problematic already. We're ready to go to the court after the story, and if they ask us to reveal your honor, we're ready to protect you. But people will turn and go away. So, like, it's okay to be cowards and never to fight for your rights, but it's so easy to blame the media for not bringing the story. You know what? If media went there and did the reporting without the proper sources and without the cases and the court process, media would be judged out of existence. And some of them have done that. So again, this is a whole issue of resilience of the courts. This is a whole issue of resilience of the whole whistleblower system. Many of those things are not there, and unless they are there, I'm not sure media has something to do with this.
Okay, thank you. You wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say something. Is it working? Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 2016 war. I think the other thing we need to really embrace is that resilience is not something where there's a start and a finish, right? And one of the biggest sort of missed opportunities from the 2016 war was to understand what wasn't working and to try to fix it in anticipation of the next one, right? I mean, I think 2016 was the first time that our side saw that modern weapons, drones, other technologies were going to play a sort of overwhelmingly important role, and government did nothing about it. And actually, it was the private sector through almost volunteer efforts at the time to try to bring together groups of people that started to develop technology. But because there was institutionalized corruption and dependence on one sort of supplier of foreign military equipment, that went nowhere. And in fact, it didn't go anywhere until 2022, when there were the incursions in Jermuk, and all of a sudden the government understood that we have, issue with supply lines, we have issue with our reliance on specific partners, and so that really changed. So I think that every time one of these things happen, whether it's the floods in Lori, or whether it's another incursion in territory, or whether it's some kind of cyber attack that really impacts a critical part of our infrastructure, we have to say, oh, that's an open area, and we have to do something about it. When you were talking about advocacy, one thing I forgot to mention in my opening comment. So during the 44-day war, the other side started a campaign where they wrote letters to the CEOs of every multinational corporation that had offices in Armenia saying, see, that's not a reliable country for you to have operations. You might want to, this is people like VMware and Synopsys, right? Thankfully, we were able to, sort of counteract that. But the point is, these are things that you don't think about, but once they happen, you have to be prepared for the next time so that you don't face it again.
Thank you, Rafi. I have to open up to questions, but before I do, Nerses, so we heard from the business sector, we heard from civil society, we heard from media. What can we take away from this conversation? And so where are the gaps that we need to start filling in to start building up the resiliency?
Listen to all these examples. I'm going to make 2 points. One, there's this assumption that resiliency develops in a vacuum. It doesn't. So we can't solve the media problem if we don't have best practices and don't have the institutions. Civil society could do so much, but if civil society's activities are not integrated with that of the government, the whole society model isn't going to work. Same with the private sector as well. So I think the way we're talking is that we are able to see and diagnose the problems. When we start talking about solutions, we're not thinking about at the systemic level. We're talking about how each sector at an ad hoc level try to solve a problem during that immediate crisis, and then once the crisis was over, they went back to living normally. And then the next question that was posed by the panelists was, well, why didn't we learn? Well, because you don't know how to learn, right? We don't know how to learn from our mistakes. There's a science to these things, right? Resiliency is a science. Having systemic solutions is science. This is why we talk about modeling countries that have the infrastructure and the institutions that they are prepared when these things happen. So when you don't have the infrastructure, the system, and the resiliency modeling, and crisis happened, you're basically putting band-aids on a problem, temporarily trying to solve it. And then once the problem is done, you forget about the future problems that are going to happen. So part of the complexity is that we operate in a vacuum, and then we solve a problem to the best of our abilities, hoping that something similar doesn't come up. But you don't deal with the inevitable by simply relying on ad hoc solutions. And so that's kind of part of the overarching problem. So we keep talking about 2020, okay? Did we know that 2023, the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh was going to happen? Yeah, we all had a pretty good idea. Okay, right? Were we resilient in absorbing that population? We kind of were, as at the societal level. Were there errors? Of course there were. But what we're talking about is, as Naira mentioned, at least we've gotten into thinking of contingency planning. At least we're using best practices for solving problems. But again, these cannot be ad hoc, right? There has to be an across-the-board, whole of society and whole of government approach. And that is the way you solve these problems. If you don't have that model, it's not going to work. It might work in few situations, but in the broader scheme of things, it's not going to be a sustainable approach.
Okay, well, this conversation can go on for 8 hours, I think, because there's a whole other thing of sort of a decentralized way of operating when there is, let's say, an external threat, right? Instead of everything being decided in Yerevan, for example, from Lori to Davush to Vayotspor, each center then operationalizes everything from media to civil society to, I don't know, defense forces. I mean, so again, we didn't cover... We won't tip of the iceberg here. But well, thank you so much to the panelists. As I said, this is a conversation that I hope we continually have and we continually discuss and in a healthy and productive way. And thank you all. Thank you.